Hi, I'm Shana Meyerson with the Yoga of War podcast, here today with legal expert Ann Herzberg. If you appreciate and find value in these important discussions, please consider supporting the show so I can continue to bring you such amazing and esteemed guests. Details are pinned in the comments below. So, when you hear the words United Nations, what words come to mind for you? Like human rights, international law, world peace, dignity, equality. If those are the words that are coming up for you, you're not paying attention. Today's UN has been captured by Islamist dictators and communists, and the more appropriate terms to describe them would be things like farce of justice, fundamentally corrupt, morally bankrupt, biased, hypocritical, anti-Western, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and of course, anti-Semitic. Throw UNRWA into the mix, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, I should say, refugees. I want to get that title exactly correct. And you find an organization that was created to fulfill an illegitimate mandate of eternally perpetuating, instead of resolving, the manufactured Palestinian refugee crisis, and has been all but completely hijacked by Hamas terrorists in the Gaza Strip. Today with me is Ann Herzberg. She is the legal advisor of NGO Monitor and a widely recognized author and commentator. She was the first to identify the phenomenon of lawfare in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and is one of the leading experts on humanitarian aid funding, the UN, and the role of NGOs in international institutions. As the UN representative for NGO Monitor, Ann regularly presents before the UN Human Rights Council and other bodies. She's the author of Best Practices for Human Rights and Humanitarian NGO Fact-Finding, among other works. And articles and opinion pieces have appeared in many major publications and scholarly journals, including Haaretz, which I won't hold against you, Fox News, well, I might hold it against you, the Wall Street Journal, and the American Journal of International Law. And thank you so much for joining me today. I absolutely loved having your colleague, Gerald Steinberg, on the show a few weeks ago, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Always so nice to see your smiling face.
Thanks.
In today's climate, political, diplomatic, there's no organization that's honestly safe from dramatic, politically charged, and often patently false accusations. When it comes to the United Nations, though, how can one reasonably conclude that they are an anti-Israel body at best and deeply anti-Semitic at worst? Can you give me some examples of systemic bias within the UN in general and the Security Council in specific against the world's only Jewish state?
Yeah, so I think there is a case to be made that for sure the UN is institutionally biased against Israel. And I think there's a good case also for saying it's institutionally anti-Semitic. Now, we can look to a few points for that, I'd say like vantage points for that. So first of all, what we can look at are the number of resolutions. So when you look at the number of resolutions, and you can go to a website such as UN Watch, they have a database where they go through all of this. There are more resolutions on Israel and have been historically than on all other countries in the world combined. So that for sure, I think, is the most telling metric of all. But I think when we dig down in the weeds a little bit more, what we need to look at, for instance, are the number of Israel-specific mechanisms at the various UN bodies. And when you look at that as well, there are far more mechanisms devoted against Israel than any other and than any other country. So we also have that mechanism. And if you want, I can get into some of those specifics.
Yes, please.
Yeah, and then I'll say there are dedicated UN agencies to the Palestinians that don't exist for any other people. And then I'd say the last thing is the way Israel is treated within specific mechanisms also differs. So again, I'm happy to get into some specifics if you want at this point.
I'm not sure if you have the numbers in front of you, and I actually heard them this morning and didn't write them down. So super pro. When you say, because I think that sometimes people can't fully grasp, when you say that there are more Security Council resolutions against Israel than all other states combined, like I was hearing like there's something like 11 against China and almost 200 against Israel, for example. Do you have any of those like state by state comparisons of the, like, do you have a comparison of some of our worst actors? Iran, for example, versus Israel?
So I don't have it off the top of my head, but again, if you go to the UN Watch database, you'll be able to see by country how the resolutions shake out. But I mean, if you look at, for instance, there have been no resolutions on Saudi Arabia. Very few resolutions on Iran for sure. Very few resolutions on Venezuela, on North Korea, even very few resolutions, if any. So when you start looking at the worst abusers in the world, there are very few resolutions against those countries. Whereas Israel basically takes up all the oxygen at the institution, without a doubt.
Can you explain like item 7 and item 2 and how these two things are particularly nefarious when it comes to Israel in comparison to every other country on earth?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to look at the UN, there's sort of three, I would say, main bodies that we look at when we're talking about resolutions. So that of course is the Security Council, which has its own setup. We have the General Assembly, and we have the Human Rights Council, which is a subsidiary body of the General Assembly. Now, when we're talking about item 2 and item 7, we're talking about the agenda items of the Human Rights Council. What's important for people first to know is originally it was called the Commission on Human Rights. And so that had been around for decades. In the mid-2000s, it was disbanded because of anti-Israel bias. But at the Commission of Human Rights, they had a standing agenda item against Israel. It was the only country with a standing agenda item. Now, so the council was disbanded because of anti-Israel bias and politicization, and it was reformed and renamed the Human Rights Council. But unfortunately, even though we had this body where they claimed the problems of the Commission on Human Rights were going to be rectified, the problems of the commission were imported into the Human Rights Council. And yeah, exactly. And I would say what's particularly egregious about that is, you have and I place massive blame on European countries because they allow this to happen. They are the US is often in and out of participation in the council and funding of the council. Europe is always the staunchest supporter of the council, and they allowed this to happen. They allowed this permanent agenda item against Israel to be carried over into the Human Rights Council. Now, when we look at the current Human Rights Council agenda, there are 10 agenda items, and most of the agenda items cover a range of topics. But what we still have is agenda item 7, which is the only agenda item against a country, and that is Israel. Now, on top of that, so there's also what's known as agenda item 4, where you can talk about country abuses. That is open to the entire world, but Israel alone has its own mechanism. Now, but what's actually disturbing about this is in recent years, And I can get into the weeds on this. It's a bit detailed, but about 10 years ago, because of the bias on item 7, the European countries decided finally they would be boycotting the item 7 session. Now, there's another backstory behind that, which is interesting, which I can get into, but for these purposes, so they started boycotting not all European countries, but most of them started boycotting the item 7 debates, and a lot of other countries followed suit. Because of this, the Palestinians and the machinery, the bureaucracy at the Human Rights Council, which is known as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, started putting Israel-specific debates also in item 2, which is a generalized item. And so what we began to see is so the council meets 3 times a year, March, June, September. We started to see now, and there are permanent discussions on Israel now under item 2 at every session. So now not only do we have the item 7 debate, which happens every session, we also now have an Israel-specific debate under item 2 now at every session. So what we have is the amount of anti-Israel of days dedicated to an anti-Israel debate has actually doubled at the council in recent years, despite the Europeans doing this boycott, which anyway over time has eroded. Okay, so that's an example.
I have to ask what is no doubt a very stupid question, but that's what I do. So it just seems like if Europe were to, the whole EU, all the countries were, or most, were to boycott these item 7 debates, then they would pass more easily because there would be no opposition. Is that not accurate?
Well, it doesn't work that way exactly, because the resolutions are, while they're tied to agenda items, they, even if like a country doesn't show up for the debate, the votes on the resolutions take place at a later time. They take place at the end of the session. And there's not always a correlation between the resolution and the debate. So European countries were still voting on the debates, on the resolutions, even if they didn't attend the debates. Now, the other thing is, even if every European country decided to vote against these resolutions, they would still pass, because there's an automatic majority at the council of hostile states to Israel and fence sitters. So often what you'll see is there'll be at least 25 to 30, there's I believe 53 members on the council. So you're automatically, in the hostile states, going to be over 20, 25. And then when you add in the fence sitters, which are typically African, Asian, and Latin American countries, that will usually push the resolution over. Wow. So even if you have all of the democratic countries, even from other parts of the world, opposing a resolution, it's very hard for them to actually win on a vote. So that's another problem with the council.
And what about just the GA, the General Assembly? I mean, when we take it basically as a whole, how's that record going?
Yeah, no, the General Assembly is equally, if not the worst, of all of the bodies. And again, there we also see, so again, there are these huge voting blocks. So you have, for instance, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Islamic and Muslim states. That's approximately 50 or so countries. You have the Arab League, so all of the Arab countries, that's also around 50 countries. And then you have what is known as well, it's kind of funny. It used to be known as the non-aligned movement. Then they were known as the G77, the group of 77, but really it's 133 countries.
Oh,
But they still
okay.
refer to it sometimes as the G77. So there's 133 of these non-aligned countries. This could be India, China, Russia, um, Brazil, South Africa, those types of countries. So again, on most things, you have this automatic voting block.
Mm-hmm.
And again, during the Cold War, it generally split along the Cold War lines. But again, the pro-Soviet bloc was much larger than the Western bloc. So really, again, they can always win a vote. It's almost impossible to not be able to win a vote.
Has anti-Israel voting gotten worse in the United Nations as a whole since October 7th?
Um, I
Or
would
has it
say
always
no.
been this bad?
It's always been bad. It's always been bad. I mean, I would say in the lead up to October 7th, it had been a bit better. For a lot of it, there really depends on who's running government. So, for instance, even a few years ago, you had a very favorable government in Canada, in Australia, in
Yes.
many European countries, in the UK. So then there were a lot more votes going Israel's way. But Argentina now is very pro-Israel. So now they often align on those votes, but in the past they did not. So a lot of it depends on who's in power. But in general, the votes have always been bad.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that overview. We're really going to be focusing primarily today on UNRWA, and we'll discuss what that is a little bit later. But just in order to frame our discussion, just on a most basic level, talking to a fifth grader, according to the United Nations, what is the definition of a refugee?
So when you want to get the definition of a refugee, you would look to the Refugee Convention,
Hmm.
which it was passed in 1951. And in that treaty, it's a treaty that countries have signed up to. I believe most countries have signed up to it. Haven't checked recently the list of signatories, so there may be a few that are not party to it. Um, but basically, it's if you are somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution um, on it could be there are certain categories, certain criteria: political, religious, um uh nationality. There's certain categories of persecution, and you are forced to leave your home. You could be considered a refugee and get refugee status. So that's sort of where you can look to the definition of a refugee.
Okay.
And when you look at, let's say, if somebody is going to the United States, for instance, and wants to apply for asylum and get refugee status, or get asylum based on the refugee status, typically those are the criteria that it will look to. It will sort of mirror what is in this convention, the Refugee Convention. But there may be certain, in each country, there may be a little tweaks here and there.
Okay. How does the United Nations, again, I'm just speaking broadly here, excuse me, how do they define their role in helping refugees? I mean, they have these commissions. What is the UN's role in helping refugees?
Well, so the UN really, I would say, considers itself the primary institution that deals with refugees. And I
Hmm.
think the international community, to an extent, has accepted that role. Um, there's the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UN. Yeah, the acronyms are very similar, but it's UNHCR as
Yeah.
opposed to UNHRC, the Human
Yeah.
Rights Council. So you have UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency, which handles, I would say probably most of the refugee crises
Hmm.
in the world. Not all, as we'll talk about. And then periodically there may be specialized UN agencies set up to deal with a particular situation, or you might have peacekeeping missions coming in that deal with refugees. But that's sort of the primary refugee framework.
Yeah, but okay, so let's frame this a little bit differently. If I were a refugee, okay, I left whatever, Ukraine, came to America, what is the goal? What is the UN or the UNHCR going to do for me? What is the goal for me as a refugee?
So I think there's a few things. I think, ideally they look to resettle people back in the
Mm-hmm.
country, or not reach. I don't know if I forget what the terminology is, if they say return or not.
Mm-hmm.
But ideally to be able to go back to your home where you're from. Um, but then there's also resettlement in the absence of being able to go back to where you're from for whatever reason, natural disaster, war, whatever it is. Resettlement is then the goal. So, okay, you can't live there. And, we saw this very clearly, after World War II, for instance. There
Mm-hmm.
were millions and millions of refugees. Many of them were not able to return to their countries where they came from, and so they were resettled in third countries. So that's kind of the ideal. But
Okay.
as we'll get
Yeah.
into, it's different when it
Yeah.
comes to the Palestinians, and also in regular refugee. I don't know if you want to say refugee law, but certainly in the refugee framework, refugee status is not passed down generation to generation.
Yeah.
So if you were, I don't know, from Poland and you were resettled in the United States, you would no longer be your children, if they were born in the United States, would no longer be considered refugees.
Sure. No matter how close it was to the time of fleeing your country.
Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong. In a sentence, the UN's goal with refugees is to ensure that they will no longer be refugees, whether through resettlement or through temporary resettlement until they're able to go back. But ultimately, the goal is to remove said refugee status and find them a
Yes.
permanent home.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, which sets us really up well for the actual meat of our conversation. So, for anyone who doesn't know, UNRWA, which isn't exactly like the acronym of how it sounds because there's a weird W in there,
Right. Right.
but it's the UN Relief and Works Agency, but it doesn't stop there, for Palestine refugees. Sounds super noble. Why do these so-called Palestine refugees have their own agency, which you've already talked about, but we haven't talked about the why, while every other refugee on earth falls under the purview of the UNHCR? Sounds a lot like the double standard that we see in the Security Council, but in reverse. It's the
Yeah.
negative. Yeah.
So, what I think people should realize, so UNRWA was established following the 1948 war. And the reason it says for Palestine refugees is because at the time it was the mandate for Palestine when they were dealing with the mandate. And then obviously Israel became a state also around that time, became a UN member state. So that is where the name came from. But I think also what people forget is UNRWA was originally mandated to deal with both Jewish and Arab refugees. It wasn't just the Arab refugees from the war. It was supposed to be dealing with both. Okay, now the Jews were resettled because, of course, we had the founding of the state of Israel, Israel becoming a member state. So at some point, it began to focus its mandate on Arab refugees.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, the Refugee Convention came about in 1951. So you may say, okay, by 1951, the Arab refugees from the war were not all resettled. So why did they not become part of the 1951 framework? Okay. Now, this is where the politics comes in because the Arab states at the time did not want the Palestinians, or at the time, the other thing we need to be clear about is when you look at UN documentation from the period, they were not called Palestinians. They were called Arabs. And I think that's very important because they were not, that parlance was not used at the time. Okay. So they were talking about the Arab refugees from the war. They wanted to use these refugees as a political issue. Now, if they had become part of the framework, for instance, because some of the refugees had gone to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, so they did not want to resettle, have these people be considered resettled and become citizens of those countries, because they wanted to keep this issue alive to be a thorn in the side of Israel. So that they are the ones that prevented UNRWA from being folded into the regular refugee framework. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing, which is very notable, and we also need to keep in mind, what was the status of Gaza and the West Bank / Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem at the time? What was the status? Who was in
Occupied
charge?
by Egypt and Jordan.
Exactly, right? So again, we have this thorny kind of issue. Um, you know, those countries at the time also did not, even though they were in control of the territory and could have resettled the people and made Gaza a state of some sort, either incorporating it, into Egypt as part of Egyptian territory or becoming a state for the refugees living there. Same with the West Bank, what Jordan renamed the West Bank. They did not do that because really they were viewing Israel as being temporary. And so they did not want they were afraid if they made their status permanent as permanent Jordanian citizens or Egyptian citizens or Syrian citizens or Lebanese citizens, that would also mean that Israel was permanent, a permanent fact. And so that's another reason why UNRWA had a separate status.
Well, boy, that opens a lot of worm cans here. One of
Yeah.
which is the fact that you're talking about 1951, but it was just 3 years prior that the UN actually ratified the Jewish state. So why would the UN want to have a special commission in the thorn of the side of the Jewish state to indicate that it has some sort of temporary nature when they just ratified it 3 years earlier?
Well, I think at the time, if you look at that, I'd have to go. I haven't looked at it recently. I'd have to go look at the voting on this issue. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what we have to look at is in that period between 1948 and 1951, we have to look geopolitically what also was happening. So, for instance, the Soviets voted for Israel to become a member state of the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they also so they voted for that and they accepted the partition plan. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you go forward in time, the Cold War is really starting to heat up in the 50s. And so, again, I'd have to look at the voting blocks. I don't remember. But I think that's a factor because we're already now starting to see the cold. It's post World War II. It's already several years now past World War II. The cold because of the Cold War. There's a lot of bloc formation happening. So
Mm-hmm.
you sort of have the Arab and Soviet interests at that time starting to align. And
Okay.
so there would be more support for the Arab position. So we have to take that into account.
Okay. So, okay, I have so many questions. I want to put them in some sort of logical order. Let me start with this. Is there any other state in the United Nations ratified as a state whose legitimacy has been not just questioned, but constantly questioned the way that Israel's has?
Not that I can think of. No.
Okay, well, that was an easy answer.
Yeah.
Um, let me ask a more complex question, something that I think most Jews right now are pretty aware of, but most non-Jews aren't, which is the fact that there was a concurrent refugee crisis that went on as the state of Israel is being formed, because as the Arabs, as you call them, the reason why even pro-Israel people now have to call them Palestinians is just to delineate which Arabs we're talking about, because they're not Arab Israeli, because these are people who have not accepted their Israeli citizenship that they were offered, right, in 48. But even as in 1948, the Arabs in the land of the Palestine Mandate were given the option of Israeli citizenship. Okay, many of them chose not to accept it. At the same time, the Jews across the Arab world were being persecuted and expelled to the tune of somewhere between around 7 and 900,000. Now, when you're saying that the original UNRWA mandate included both the Jewish refugees and the Arab refugees, and it seems as if the Jewish refugees were just like, oh, well, and done with them. How could this mandate have been created for both, but gone in two such diametrically opposed directions? And really quickly, because you mentioned it, but I'm not sure that people who aren't familiar fully caught it, so feel free to expound. What you had said earlier was that you had pointed out or alluded to is that a refugee, a Palestinian refugee, their descendants, not just like if it was within a year or 5 years of them becoming refugees, but forever, get to, like a passport, they get their parents' refugee status and their grandparents and their great grandparents, which is the exact opposite of how a refugee is dealt with in any other part of the world. But that it seems, from all that I know from history, that the Jewish refugees were never even dealt with at all.
Yeah, so I think that's another fact that gets ignored, particularly at the UN,
Mm-hmm.
um, where so when we look at the war, so I mean the estimates vary, but I think they say probably around 700,000. There were probably around 700,000 Arab refugees, um, and but on a virtual similar number, around 800,000 Jewish refugees left Arab lands. Now, some of that was, I mean, voluntary. They weren't in a lot of cases kicked out,
Mm-hmm.
but even though it may have been voluntary, it was because the discrimination was so high in those countries, they had to leave. And these people were not, they had to leave all of their property. They were not compensated. And so they came. So there was a virtual, I'd say, almost equivalent number of population shift.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think the other thing that people have to remember is this was not unusual at the time. Because today, when they talk about the Nakba or, these types of claims, what they were erasing is this was not unusual. There was nothing sui generis about the situation at the time in the post-World War II era. Again, millions and millions of people were shifting populations in Europe. That was happening at the time. Also, if you look at India and what became Pakistan, there was the partition of India. So, and you had again millions and millions of people shifting population transfer essentially to create the state of Pakistan and a state of India, and then Bangladesh, Eastern Pakistan. So in context, this was not unusual. So, but later on, it became the anti-Israel movement and the Arab states really tried to portray this as somehow a unique phenomenon when that just simply wasn't the case.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that many of them weren't forced out because, first of all, many of them were. There was
Yeah,
basically an ethnic cleansing of Jews across the Arab world. There were also the people who are like, oh my gosh, there's a new Jewish state. Let's go there. But in
yeah,
today's terminology, I guess we would call it constructive eviction, right? Like that Jews were basically living as dhimmis in all of these states as second or third class citizens. And I might argue that's no life at all. But
yeah.
the other thing that's very interesting, Anne, is that you alluded to the fact that they could have created a Gazan state. We're talking about back then when
Hmm.
people, may not have caught in that flurry of explanation was that Egypt actually was occupying Gaza at the time, and they could have made it a Gazan state. Now, the irony being, of course, that in 2005, Israel did create a de facto Gazan state in Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip when they unilaterally withdrew from the territory. But the world still considered them to be occupiers, which is hysterical when they even dug up the graves of Jews so there wouldn't be a single Jew left in Gaza. But we see what they did with that state.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so it's known as the disengagement, um, the 2005 pullout from Gaza. I think, and I've lived in Israel now over 20 years, and I moved there about a year before the disengagement. And I think what's at the time, the vast majority of the Israeli public was in favor of the disengagement. So I think people
Mm-hmm.
forget that. In polls, it was something like 80% or maybe even more of the Israeli public was in favor of the disengagement. Because I think at the time, people thought, even though, of course, we're aware of the risks, and unfortunately, a lot of the predictions that were made came true about it. But at the time, I think what people were hoping was, okay, the Palestinians living in Gaza are now given this territory. Let's see what they do with it. And if they do great things with this territory, then we can use that as a model and apply that to the West Bank, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And instead, it ended up in disaster because you had Hamas almost immediately come in and seize control of the territory. And instead of building, luxury hotels and creating a beautiful territory, they burned down the greenhouses and started fortifying it with tunnels in order to wage war. So that's unfortunately what happened. But people deliberately, I think it's deliberate, omit that context, particularly at the UN in
Sure.
UN reporting.
And why, when it comes to Israel, is there so little regard in the United Nations for legal terminology, such as the term of occupation, or most notoriously, genocide or apartheid? That these definitions seem to mean nothing when it comes to Israel. They just disregard the actual standards and create what is very well known now as a double standard. And as we know, or as most of us know, double standards are anti-Semitic.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what they do. They've taken these legal terms. Now, much of the time it was applied colloquially, but the thing that they do, and I call them weasel words, and the reason I call them weasel words is because for two reasons. Number one, even though they're legal terms, they have a very strong narrative, normative, moral resonance. So when you hear the phrase apartheid, you immediately think of South Africa, okay, and what was happening in South Africa. When you hear genocide, you think of the Holocaust. You might think of Rwanda, but generally you're thinking of the Holocaust. And then and same thing with occupation, you're thinking of this kind of moral oppression on people. So even though they have even if they're not meeting the legal definition, it's still creating this the resonance. So you win on the narrative war by using that terminology. So that's one thing. But the other thing is a word like occupation, okay? When the word occupation is used, most, I would say, liberal Western audiences, when they hear the word occupation, they think Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem. They don't think 48 boundaries of Israel, okay? When the Palestinians use the phrase occupation, they also mean Israel.
Right.
So Haifa, Tel Aviv, that's what Beersheba, that's what occupation means to them.
From the river to the sea.
So it's a very good way to exploit Western liberal audiences, because when they're speaking, their population knows what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very deceitful because to Western ears, they are not thinking about it in the way that the Palestinians are thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so that's also why it is so deceptive to use that wording.
I still can't wrap my head around why they go to such great lengths to make these deceptions against Israel or for the Palestinians. And I have to say that to be pro-Palestinian today generally means anti-Israel. It doesn't just mean I stand for the people of Palestine, which is a non-existent state. But in their minds, it is. I'm sorry, I'm so blurry here for some reason. I'm going to switch my camera. I don't know what happened. But let's just switch this off. I just don't understand, Anne. Is it because I mean, and even if it is because the Red Green Alliance that took over as the Islamic communist bloc in the 1970s originally to defeat America, even if it is that, why have countries like France and England and Japan and I mean they're basically the people voting for Israel these days are like America, Argentina, and like Rarotonga.
So
I just don't understand. I just can't wrap my head around why go to such great lengths that there's no plausible deniability that these double standards are so rife within the institution that
mhm.
that they continue to propagate this anti-Israel not just agenda, but as you're saying, the narrative, the words that they choose, everything seems to be very much stacked against the Jews, wherein, keeping in mind that the UN was formed like in the shadow of World War II because of the horrors of World War II, you would think there would be something ingrained in them that was like, hey, we should look out for these Jews a little bit.
I mean, I really think we just have to look at politics. unfortunately, a lot of countries like to talk about international law. Um, but I think many times those countries are using it as really a weapon or using it for political purposes. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind because again, yeah, the way in which they abide by international law, there's double standards all over the place. Many of these countries, France, Denmark, Norway, they're violating international law all the time. Also, every country does. Every country, no country has a perfect record on international law, so that's ridiculous. But I think you also have to look at politics. So depending on what period of time we're talking about, certainly like if you're looking in the 70s, oil, a lot of these countries were dependent on Arab oil. So they were not going to go against the Arab states, so that was a huge thing. I think today, that obviously is still a factor, but I think today you have to look at things like many of these countries have very large Muslim populations, and that's a very significant voting bloc in many countries. France, the UK, they have a very substantial electoral power, and politicians want their votes, so they're going to go with the policies that those segments of the population are advocating for. And then you have, and many, especially today, right now, there are many far left governments. We look at Spain, basically ruled by communists.
I try not to look at Spain.
Yeah. So Spain is controlled by communists. Greece was for a time. The UK, the Labour Party is very far left. Same in Australia. So it really depends on that as well. And then in some cases, I'm not saying all, but obviously anti-Semitism plays a role as well in some countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic that tiny little Israel, I guess they're just the right size to be used as a political football that everybody can kick them around. But so many people want to deny it. But if you read between the lines of what you're saying, and the anti-Israel agenda, it disguised today, meaning like today as the pro-Palestinian agenda, is ultimately a religious war, is it not?
I mean, I think so in a lot of senses, yeah. I think that aspect of the conflict is unfortunately not studied enough. I think it's scary to accept that. I think that's why people tend to look at it more or want to view it more as a real estate problem. And I think, we have to look at, I mean, this is where we go back to the disengagement, where we can see it wasn't a real estate problem, where we can see Camp David. I mean, all the many times, the partition plan, the 3 No's of Khartoum, the Camp David, the 2007 offers, the attempts in the 2010s to start again a new peace process. The Oslo process. We have so many examples where if the Palestinians had wanted to solve a real estate problem, they easily could have done it. And they don't. And they don't offer an alternative either. So that's the other thing, So they rejected all these plans and they didn't make any alternative counter offers, so we say. And I agree with you. I think that's for far too long, people have been ignoring the role that religion has been playing.
Yeah. And what's also quite ironic is that, as you mentioned before, there are actually like millions of Palestinians not just living in Israel or in the Palestinian territories, but living in neighboring countries hold on one sec, such as Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, where they are actually living in literal refugee camps. Not like in Israel, where if you accepted your Israeli status, you live with full and equal rights. And yet, all the blame of this purported and perpetual refugee crisis gets thrown on Israel. I mean, it's just like with the Gaza war. Nobody was mentioning the fact that Egypt was locking them in from the south, which would have been a much more logical route for people who had just invaded their other neighboring country, which had every reason to keep them out. But no, this was all Israel's fault. Everything is Israel's fault. So ultimately, it seems to me that by all these perpetuations, it's the United Nations that is actually, in many ways, fomenting the Palestinian rage against their purported oppressors, Israel, and nobody else. So how can this Palestinian refugee crisis ever end if the United Nations continues and insists on perpetuating their refugee status?
Well, I'll even say this, if Palestine now is a state, which according to the UN it is, so why are they refugees? They're living in their state. So why are the, what is it, 2 million people in Gaza, 3 million people? Why are they refugees? This is supposedly the state of Palestine. The state of Palestine, has non-member observer state status at the UN. It got upgraded status recently. It walks around, the PA walks around all the time claiming it's a state. Okay, so then why are the people living in your state, are you considering them refugees still? I mean, that makes no sense,
That was just... Yeah, that was actually my very next question.
Yeah.
But I'll just sort of stack on that.
Yeah.
So let's go back to UNRWA. So let's just say, okay, so we have 157 out of 193 UN member states that formally recognize the state of Palestine. Most of them are still pouring money into UNRWA. I'm just wondering, how long will they be able to continue to reconcile funding an agency built on a premise that their own recognition invalidates? At some point, it seems like this flame will have to extinguish itself, no?
I mean, one would think if one was rational, but I mean, this is the UN, and we're not just, the thing I think people really need to walk away from with this is it's not just UNRWA. We need to note there's also something called the Division of Palestinian Rights at the UN, which operates also several sub bodies. There's the UNISPAL, which is the Palestinians get their own UN, basically propaganda agency, run through the UN. They have a committee, the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. They have their own division at the UN, plus they have UNRWA. They have all of these independent mechanisms that do not exist for any other peoples. And essentially is pushing out, like you were saying before, is the UN fomenting the conflict? Absolutely. These agencies are constantly pumping out right of return nonsense. They are, every couple months has anti-Israel conferences calling for the elimination of Israel, boycotting Israel. The UNISPAL sends out a memo, a newsletter every couple weeks that is just highlighting anti-Israel events around the world. And once we actually have UN status, our organization, but once I tried to join the UNISPAL, the Division of Palestinian Rights, get accreditation there. This was before we had UN accreditation. And so why can't our stuff be on the UNISPAL website? Oh no.
Right.
So it's open to a select few of NGOs. Oh, and lo and behold, they're all anti-Israel. So no group if you're even just a normal NGO, you don't get in this newsletter. You're an anti-Israel NGO. That's the only way you can get into this newsletter. So there's so many layers in ways in which the UN is pushing the conflict. Um, I don't see it ever burning itself out, unfortunately.
And this is year
Unless, yeah,
and this is
yeah,
year
yeah,
round. I mean, is the propaganda
yeah.
this intense even when there is no like kinetic war going on?
Yes, it's been around since these divisions have been around since 1975. They were founded the same day as the Zionism is racism resolution.
Right. Okay. But who's the target audience? Is it to give UN members talking points? Is it to convince? I don't fully understand like what is the actual goal of UniPal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a few things. I think it is pushing the Palestinian narrative across the globe. So,
To
for
whom?
instance, so I'll give you an example. In 1979, the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People issued a history of the conflict. Now, they didn't list any authors, so we don't know who wrote this document, but it's obvious it's a very one-sided history, completely from the Palestinian narrative. Okay. When Again, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but when the International Criminal Court in 2020, when the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court decided she was going to open a case against Israel, even though she had no jurisdiction, she relied on that document. She cited that document, I can't even remember how many times, as the basis for why she believed there was jurisdiction in the conflict. And I'm like, you're citing this history from a UN body that has no author and it's completely one-sided. So that's an example of
Hmm.
how this propaganda gets used. It gives succor to the BDS movement because it's constantly promoting BDS and promoting anti-Israel events. It keeps alive things like the genocide lie or the starvation lie because they're just being constantly talked about in UN bodies. And then they issue reports that are then cited on campus, let's say, campus resolutions, shareholder resolutions, so they get repeated everywhere.
That's unbelievable. And also I want to also note that so like I want to go back to Gaza because this is so top of mind and so cogent to obviously everything that's going on today. But approximately half of students through I guess grade 9 go to UNRWA schools, and the other half go to government-run schools. And another word for government, of course, being Hamas. So we can all guess what a kid will learn in a Hamas-run school. What are they learning? What is a typical Gazan child learning in an UNRWA school?
Well, so what we have to note is UNRWA curriculum is largely the same as the PA curriculum.
Okay.
Okay, so even if the kid is not in an UNRWA school, they're still getting the same bad education. Okay, so it's but but one would think if you're in the UN school funded by international taxpayers all over the world, you might try to do a little bit of a better job. But obviously, they seem to be unable to do that. Um, but things like that I have seen, and there's studies out there. Like if you look at a group called Impact SE, they go
Mm-hmm.
around and study the textbooks. They review the textbooks. So if you want specifics, people should go look at their website, and there's lots of examples. But some that have stuck out in my mind is math problems, for instance. Will use framing in the examples that are anti-Israel or promote terrorism. So that might be that's how these messages get inculcated. The erasure of Israel on maps, the constant teaching of this return rhetoric. So you're like inculcating fantasies into these children that their home is really in Haifa or Beersheba.
Right.
And one day, all they're going to do is go back and take it. And we saw that on October 7th. I mean, that October 7th was the product of decades of UNRWA education. Okay. They can lie about it all they want, but that's what they're taught in school.
Yeah.
Is let's go back and take it, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what they did. And thousands of civilians joined in with Hamas to cross that border and massacre people. You know, so that's the kind of stuff being taught. And you see it also, like, let's look at those ceremonies that took place with the hostages. Like, what kind of sick society would do something like that? I mean, you watch that and you can't believe it. Like,
and bring their kids to dance on stage.
yeah. Or like the Gaza March of Return, which I contend were planning ops for October 7th, even though the UN claimed they were expressions of human rights and exuberance, and there were poets there. If you read the UN report about it, that's what they say. But it's quite obvious now that these were planning ops to test the Israeli border defenses to lead up to October 7th. That's obviously what they were for. But they brought their children. Or like, who allows their kid to engage in armed confrontations with the military? And we also see that in the West Bank. I mean, it's not just Gaza. You see people bringing your children, you know, and okay, you want to have a riot against or get into an armed confrontation with Israeli soldiers. Okay, why are you bringing 5-year-old children? I mean, it's what parent does that? I'm a parent. I can't imagine putting my children in that, like weaponizing my children that way. That's like twisted.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't think that comes from nowhere. I mean, where do kids learn things? They learn things from school and from their society, and schools often reflect the society the kids are living in. So.
Well, absolutely. And it was basically one generation, basically 18 years from the time that Hamas came into, Hamas came into power to 2023, which is basically one generation. That's when we're going to see these teenage terrorists. And also, just for people who don't understand how math could be anti-Israel, because you didn't give an example, but an example would be a simple example. You know, in America, we learn you go to the store, you buy 3 apples, then you buy 2 more. How many apples do you have? And the answer is 5 apples. But there they would say, if there are 5 IDF soldiers or Jews, whatever, fill in the blank with your favorite Jewish person, and you kill 3 of them, how many are left? And the answer is 5 minus 3 is 2. 3 dead Jews, 2 living Jews. And this may sound like some sort of South Park cartoon, but that's literally like what their math problems look like, which is insane. And their kindergarten plays, you can see them all over.
Yeah, exactly. Like practicing stabbing people, practicing taking people hostage. That's all in So I mean, I don't love it, but I think it'd be a very interesting study to see how many of the people that participated in October 7th in the atrocities, and we can even take it down to another level, were directly involved in hostage taking. How many of those people participated in those types of plays in their kindergarten? I bet you would find a direct correlation between those people, you know.
Well,
but also
kindergarten into their summer camps.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the other point. You look at the children's programming on TV. You look at the camps, like summer camps, after school activities. There's not one area of the life of a Palestinian child that isn't geared towards this indoctrination. And again, UNRWA has a lot to answer for, because are they the other thing also, when you look at UNRWA, which is 99% of the UNRWA employees are local Gazans.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's another fact people need to look at. So even if the internationals in UNRWA were against this type of thing, maybe they are, maybe they're not. Most of the officials I see from UNRWA are quite despicable, in my opinion. The type of rhetoric they use, it's been pretty terrible. But they're not in control of what's going on the ground. You know, when you're dealing with 30,000 employees, 99% of which are locals, it's impossible to have any real oversight over what's going on in any individual school. So that's kind of the other problem.
Yeah, but one of the points that was actually in Trump's 20-point plan that seems to be sort of like glossed over, it was this element of re-education or deprogramming, which we've seen fairly effectively in places like UAE, or even to an extent, from what I understand, Saudi Arabia. So I don't see how we're going to have any potential for a better future, or any for the people of Gaza, or any prospects of peace, as long as UNRWA and Hamas are controlling the education system. So, I mean, what worries me a lot in a lot of different respects is how, in exchange for this, what Trump calls peace, and it is not peace. It's hudna, and it's at best a ceasefire, at best. There's this sort of sweeping under the rug of, and we need to do a major overhaul of the entire civilization, if you could call it civil. And I'm afraid that they just keep sort of giving more and more of the mandate back to UNRWA and back to Hamas to control the population. And so we're just going to see more and more radicalized, not just children, but generations of children. We have to understand that when you radicalize a full generation, then that means the parent and the child are radicalized. You go one more generation, now you got your grandparent, the parent, and the child all radicalized. I mean, that's a hard knot to untie.
Yeah, it's going to be very tricky. I mean, I'm not sure how much of a role UNRWA is going to play. I mean, I think that's sort of what's being negotiated at the moment. I think the idea is to bring in curricula from the UAE, but will it also mean bringing in teachers from the UAE, or are they going to rely on local Gazans to teach the kids? Those types of details are very important, but we really don't have a clear idea about that. Um,
Well, yeah. When you say that it seems like maybe power is being taken away from UNRWA, you're not sure about whether it's really, being phased out. I would argue. I mean, the most disturbing point is that one of UNRWA's major roles during, particularly this most recent Gaza war, was to distribute aid to the people of Gaza. I can't even say anything without like air quotes. So like Israel facilitated this massive and unprecedented wartime aid surge into Gaza, equivalent to like 3,000 calories per person per day. And UNRWA has been completely complicit in allowing Hamas to hijack more than 90% of that aid, and not give it to, but sell it to their own people at severely inflated prices in a time when there's zero economy. And that money, of course, goes right back into rebuilding Hamas's terrorist infrastructure. Now, before Trump's 20-point plan, it looked like Israel and the GHF had gained control over gains control over the aid distribution. And as we know, those who control the food control the population. I know that sounds nefarious. I don't mean it in that, but the population is dependent on those who feed them. So I'm wondering though, because this is one of those sort of like under the table, okay, we're going to give UNRWA back the ability to administer the aid, and that does not seem to the average person to be a bad thing, but ultimately was returning the administration of the aid back to UNRWA the linchpin that ultimately guaranteed Hamas's survival.
Well, I'm not sure actually that it has been given back to UNRWA. That part I'm not sure about, because there are other UN agencies operating there now that are, for instance, like the World Food Program. Um, and they're also now trying now, whether or not in practice it's going to work, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But they're trying things like cash apps and using vendors that are vetted and not tied to Hamas. I'm skeptical about those things, but I do think I am not sure. UNRWA is doing everything it can to maintain its footholds,
Mm-hmm.
but I am not sure right now how. It's unclear. I tried looking it up, and it's just unclear the extent to which UNRWA is still controlling things there. I think that it's not clear to me
Oh,
what precisely is going on.
okay, but are any of the other NGOs any better? I mean, one thing that definitely stood out from my conversation with Gerald was that I asked him flat out, are there any NGOs that are operating in Gaza that are not currently infiltrated by Hamas? And his answer was no. It wasn't even a qualified no. So does it really matter if it's World Food or whatever, World Kitchen or, World Health or UNRWA or, name the NGO? Does it really matter? I mean, isn't it all to some extent infiltrated by and controlled by Hamas or Hamas elements?
Um, I don't know. Like with the new system in place, so you have the civilian. This it's called the CMCC, the Civilian Military Coordination Committee,
Mm-hmm.
and so they right now are operating the aid distribution. And they're doing it in conjunction with UN agencies, with vetted and approved NGOs. Um, so I'm not sure. Uh, Again, we'll have to sort of see how over time whether they also are infiltrated with Hamas. The idea now is that they are not supposed to be with the vetted NGOs. Whether that's true in practice, I don't know,
Okay.
but that's certainly the intention, and they've restricted about 3 dozen NGOs who've refused to cooperate with the new regulations.
Yeah.
So hopefully, the groups operating there now are at least better than what came before.
Okay.
Now, I don't want to be totally pessimistic about it yet. Put
Okay.
it that way, because I do think people are acting in good faith at the moment, trying to prevent a repeat of what happened and under the new systems.
Okay. Based on the last hour and 15 minutes of conversation, the words good faith and UN don't land well with me in the same sentence unless it's the UN does not act in good faith. But
Well, the UN isn't the one in control, so that's why. That's
no,
why I'm saying that.
but you
So
did
what
say
we're
various UN organizations and NGOs.
sure.
Yeah.
So the UN, certain UN agencies are working,
Yeah.
but it's 29 countries are involved in the CMCC, and UN is part of it, but they're not in charge of it. And so I think that's the difference.
Okay.
But we'll see. But we'll
Yeah.
see.
We'll hope for the best. I
Yeah.
just want to point out a couple more things that people might not be aware of. the big disturbing and damning discovery during the Gaza war was that Hamas had a server farm located directly beneath UNRWA headquarters, and in fact were using UNRWA's electricity to power their entire operation. So there's, again, zero plausible deniability there. And yet, how does the United Nations and its member states still pretend that UNRWA and Hamas are not in cahoots?
They they can't pretend, but they do. I mean, there's really, and they've known it for decades. I mean, they can't. They knew. I remember even in 2016, I attended a talk by Pierre Krahenbuhl, who was the head of UNRWA at the time,
Okay.
at Harvard. I went to hear him give a talk at Harvard, and this was, a little bit after the 2014 war. And in 2015, there was a report called the Board of Inquiry that came out from a UN body. And basically, in this UN report, which was unusual, they noted that weapons have been stored in UN facilities, including UNRWA facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question to him during the talk was, given the BOI, the Board of Inquiry's report, saying that there were weapons hidden in UNRWA installations, are you, as head of UNRWA, going to undertake a comprehensive investigation of the use of your facilities and their commandeering by Hamas and other terrorist organizations? And he said no.
Right. An unqualified no, just no.
It was an unqualified no. He did not care. And they were not interested. They know this was going on. And what's even more egregious with him, he became the head of the ICRC a few years ago.
Right.
Now, he also had to resign from UNRWA due to a personal scandal. Mm-hmm. But setting that aside, how could someone who headed UNRWA, where its facilities were all the things that we know about UNRWA, then goes on to head the ICRC, which is the body supposedly entrusted with upholding international humanitarian law. Mm-hmm. And you have this person who is part of this agency where there are so many violations of IHL. You can't even count them all. There's so many of them. So it's just, this just goes to show, what's going on there. So they clearly know about it. Instead, they write these whitewashing reports that try to clear the agency, or they try to claim, it's, just a few bad apples. But interestingly, in 2024, the Wall Street Journal issued a study that found that UNRWA had a higher percentage of Hamas members than the general population of Gaza.
Right.
So that just goes to show.
That's amazing. I mean, it's funny, not funny. I find myself laughing all day at these things, but they're not funny at all. I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, the ICRC is the International Committee of the Red Cross. All you need to know is Red Cross. So when she's talking about this nefarious actor, who happens to be the same actor who did absolutely nothing to help the Israeli hostages, we're talking about the Red Cross. So now this halo effect, right? The halo hopefully is starting to break for anybody who's made it this far into this conversation, because even more damning is that after the atrocities of October 7th, Israel provided proof that at least 12 UNRWA members took direct part in murdering and kidnapping Israelis, as well as providing material support for Hamas. Further, it was revealed that at least, now these are conservative estimates, unlike the Gaza Ministry of Health, otherwise known as Hamas, which just makes up numbers as they go to try to provide sensationalist headlines. Israel actually crosses their T's, dots their I's, and makes sure that they can verify anything they say, such as the fact that at least 10% of all UNRWA members have direct ties to Hamas or PIJ. which is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Um,
But I mean, that's also outrageous. Think about it. They had each of these terror groups had a union within UNRWA. Okay, UNRWA officials knew about this. They knew about this. The UN knew about this. Like, how sick is that? Oh, we have the ISIS club in our school. Like, oh, some of our teachers are unionized. They're all the Hamas union. Some are the PIJ. Some are ISIS. Some are the PFLP. I mean, what kind of school is this? Like, it. Can you imagine?
It sounds like yes, it's called Columbia University, but at
Well,
least it doesn't start in kindergarten anymore.
but I mean, what school system can anyone think of like, oh yes, part of our teachers, are part of the this
Yeah.
mafia, and some are part of the this drug cartel, and some of them are part of, this
Well,
gang.
I,
It,
I
it's
I'm not being facetious. The LA Teachers Union is another one, actually. So we could go down the list, Philadelphia
yeah.
Teachers Union. So sadly enough, we're seeing it more and more in America. We joke about it, but as ludicrous as it might sound, our education system is being hijacked, and it's mostly coming from within the unions. And there are pro-terrorist elements who are trying to, not trying to, they're succeeding at rewriting curricula, and also just really heavily influencing just the environment at schools. It has become aggressive and threatening to Jewish students, having nothing to do with whether they have any connection to Israel or even Zionism. So that's the kind of schools, and I think that people really need to wake up to the fact that, as ludicrous as it sounds going on in Gaza, I would argue it's even more ludicrous that it's happening here in Los Angeles, in New York, and Philadelphia, and Chicago, and go down the list.
Yeah. But in
Yeah.
any event, you're running a school, you're funded by the UN, which is built on certain values. You're getting billions of dollars in taxpayer aid from
Yep.
across the globe. And you don't have a problem with the fact that your teachers are unionized based on what terror group they're in. I mean, yeah.
That's classic.
It's beyond belief. And then if you say that to an UNRWA official, they would probably look at you like you're crazy,
Right. Sure.
Or they give you this sort of blank look, like, what's the problem?
Yeah. So before we wrap up, because I know we've been going for a while, I do want to make sure that we cover Francesca Albanese, the terrorist in word and spirit, but not in actions, so far as we know. So Albanese, for anyone who doesn't know, is the UN Special Rapporteur for, I hope I pronounced that correctly, for the occupied Palestinian territories, a title that within itself is rife with anti-Israel rhetoric and propaganda. Those occupied Palestinian territories they refer to, as Anne has already pointed out, are what you and I would call Israel. Just this morning, in fact, France and Italy announced that they will be formally calling for her resignation about time. But before we get into the wonderful and upstanding anti-Semite that she is, what is the actual job description of her role?
So she's a special rapporteur now. And basically she operates under the Human Rights Council. So within the Human Rights Council, they're known as special procedures. They have approximately 75 mandate holders, as they're called, and she is the mandate holder on for the Palestinians for this mandate. And it's actually the only mandate, again, this is an example of bias, the only mandate that never expires. All of the other mandates have to be renewed annually. Hers is the only one that exists in perpetuity until the end of the occupation. What does that mean? I don't know. So that exists forever. And her mandate officially is just to cover violations by Israel. Okay. So whenever you have a mandate on a territory, in every other case, they look at violations by all actors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Her mandate only looks at Israel. So, that now some very few, she is not included in this group. There have been a couple that have tried to broaden the mandate so that it wasn't, I mean, they're all terrible, but some tried to make it a little less biased and would also look at violations by Palestinian actors. But she takes her job very seriously. Now, these special rapporteurs are supposed to uphold what's known as the code of conduct. They have a code of conduct. They're supposed to uphold them, but there's no enforcement mechanism if they don't. They have a committee that's supposed to look at complaints, but they're all a club. So it's very rare that a rapporteur is going to get criticized by the committee. Happens occasionally. But they all are pretty much in lockstep ideologically, with again a few exceptions. And also, you can't get fired. Like that's the other thing.
Yeah.
You can't get fired. So there's no mechanism for removing a mandate holder. So I don't know how they're going to get rid of her. Even if they call for her to be gotten rid of, it would, I believe, require a resolution.
Well, they're calling for her resignation, so
yeah. So right, like if she wants to resign, why would she resign though? She doesn't.
Well,
I don't see why.
Been sanctioned by the United States, and right now it's just two states, but it's happening on February 23rd, which is in almost 2 weeks from now. My guess is that a lot more hopefully, a lot more countries are going to get in line, and pressure's pressure. But
maybe. I'm not optimistic, but on that, but we'll see.
Neither am I. So they have a special rapporteur to look for violations by Israel. I'm going to ask a stupid question because I know the answer. Is there a special rapporteur to report on violations by terrorists such as Hamas in the Palestinian territories or state, as more than 150 states recognize it?
Possibly. I will actually say possibly. There is a rapporteur on terrorism. But in general, the person in that role is always looking to undo counterterror regulations.
Yeah.
In theory, there are some mandates that could cover that topic. Very few of them ever do.
But there's no one assigned to
not specifically.
If the Israel-Palestinian conflict is the most important conflict in the entire world, and the Palestinians get all these special mandates that are just for them, you'd think that somebody would say, well, maybe we should also look in the other direction, where these
it happens on occasion, but it's rare.
But there's no one dedicated. Terrorism is a very big umbrella.
Yeah.
Palestinian terrorism would be the actual counterpart to her role.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So she actually worked for UNRWA for about a decade before becoming the special rapporteur for undermining Israel. And just last week at an Al Jazeera conference for Islamist terrorists, she referred to Israel as humanity's common enemy. This is rhetoric stolen directly from Nazi propaganda. Now, you said that you alluded to this, but not the specifics, that a UN special rapporteur officially is meant to be independent, objective, and impartial. So given her past of working with UNRWA for 10 years and her present, how was she installed in this position? And even more offensively, how was she very recently reappointed?
So the way it works is there's a committee that basically people apply.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we're talking about her position, everyone who applied was horrible. I mean, I knew she was going to get picked. I read all the resumes. Like, she's definitely going to get it because everyone before her was a man. So it's definitely going to be a woman this time. And there were three women, and she was the most egregious. I knew she was going to get it, so she did. Well, we can blame Canada because Canada was one of the countries that agreed to her candidacy. There was, I forget who the other two were at the time. But Canada, basically, it rotates. There's a committee of three countries
Mm.
that looks through all the candidates and then recommends the candidate to the president of the council, the Human Rights Council, and then they're essentially voted on. But if the president puts someone forward, it's rare that that person would not be appointed. So that's how she got in originally.
I don't,
Uh,
I actually didn't even mean so much logistically. I just meant
oh
because
yeah.
she doesn't fit any of the qualifications. How, how, again, like, why are they so willfully blind to these,
Oh yeah.
the,
Well, they ignore their own rules. And then in terms of how she got reappointed, it's completely secretive. We have no idea how.
oh,
Yeah, because there's no she it just happened.
oh,
Like,
okay.
yeah, we don't know what was going on in that process
Okay.
and why
So
she got reappointed.
maybe the Hamas fairies had something to do with
Yeah.
it. So,
I mean, it's all a lot of it is machinations behind the scenes with states in cahoots with the president of the council, whoever happens to be the president. So sometimes, you could have a president who's more conscientious or from a country that's more not as hostile to Israel. And in those cases, they wouldn't let things like that happen. But in many cases, it's a hostile country and they allow this stuff to go on.
wow. Okay, so we're going to sort of wind this down. And I just want to, like, just to tie everything we said back to how we started, to anyone not paying attention, and that is most people, it makes sense to believe that the United Nations represents the height of justice and virtue and have nothing but purely benevolent intentions and actions. So when the UN falsely accuses Israel of genocide or starvation or ethnic cleansing or apartheid, the world nods its head in complete agreement and jumps like lemmings into the Intifada revolution. So how can this virtue fallacy ever be overcome?
I mean, it's very difficult. I think as Americans, America is more inclined to be skeptical of the UN. I think it's because of our political system, because of um, a lot of times the UN works against American interests.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a natural skepticism, I believe, about the UN. But in other countries, it's completely the opposite. And in Europe, the UN can do no wrong. They people like in America, if you cite to a UN report, people will probably laugh at you. Oh, And also in Israel, of course, we have the phrase shmoom, who cares about the UN?
Right.
Um, but in most countries, it's like taken as gospel. So
Well, when you say in America, are you talking about like in the halls of Congress or are you talking about on my street? Because I could tell you that if I took a um, a survey of everyone on my street in Brentwood in Los Angeles, I could pretty much guarantee 90% of them would think that UN is a very, very just body.
I think I've had different experiences when I talk to people. I think
Okay.
Congress, certainly in Congress, that's true,
Sure.
and on a bipartisan basis,
Yes.
maybe it's shifting a little bit. Probably LA is a little more, politically a bit different than the rest of America,
Yeah.
but I think, I mean, I do think Congress also reflects the will of the people. So I don't think if there was more positive feelings about the UN, I don't believe Congress would be so anti-UN, So I do
Okay.
think that's my, but again, I don't have survey data on it, but but I do think in general it's much easier to make an argument that the UN has big problems
Yeah.
and is a flawed body in the United States than it is in other countries. I think also how our legal system looks at UN documents and that kind of thing. It's just very different in other countries.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It is honestly, it's just so ironic to hear like states throughout the United Nations alleging that Israel has no legitimacy when it was actually the United Nations that ratified Israeli statehood in 1948. Then again, the same body passed the vehemently anti-Semitic Zionism is racism resolution in 1975, and then rescinded it in 1991. So, I mean, to be honest, it has been a checkered history for sure when it comes to Israel and the Jews. But do you think that the UN may someday swing back into the Jews are okay after all camp, or is the hijacking by Islamists and dictatorial states now irreversible?
I mean, I think it was always the case. I don't think the UN has really ever operated without that.
Well, they
I mean,
voted, they
because they're
rescinded the Zionism is racism. That was a pretty big, today, that, first of all, I think that resolution would pass with flying colors, but I don't think anybody would rescind it today.
well, I think that when that happened, you had to look at the geopolitical moment that it
Mm-hmm.
happened because it happened like right after the Iraq War, the first Gulf War.
Mm-hmm.
So there was political. It has to be placed into the political context of the time. It was the end of the Cold War. It was the defeat of Iraq, the invasion of Kuwait.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a U.S. initiative. I think there was a lot of, you know, because of the that unique political moment, it happened. But aside from that moment, I mean, there's very few instances where the UN has not acted in a way
Yeah.
that in an egregious way. So aside from, the partition plan, voting in Israel as a member state, um, there's very few other instances you can point to.
Got it. So the United Nations
Yeah,
has this like super long history of anti-Israel leaders, states, councils, agencies, commissions, bodies,
yeah,
courts, organizations, secretariats, special rapporteurs, and resolutions. On top of that,
yeah.
they whitewash terror and they relentlessly demonize the Jewish state. Why is Israel still in the United Nations?
So I think it's important for Israel to be there because Israel is a country that deserves its place in that body as a global institution.
Mm-hmm.
And it's better to be there than not be there, I think. Um, and even if you're the lone voice, it's still good to have that voice. So I think from that perspective, it's important that it's there. Um, Even just to get your position on the record, I think is
Yeah.
important.
It's just
Um,
so abusive.
yeah, I mean, I think it's abusive, but I think you can, it's depending on how you manage. I think a lot of it's how you manage it, and you can use your platform. You can make the most of your platform as well, you
Yeah,
know.
sure. Do you think that
Yeah.
the UN ultimately has like enough moral integrity to protect Israel's very existence as we seem to be heading into this really, really dark and deeply anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic future?
I don't. Luckily, Israel's existence is not dependent on the UN. Put it that way.
Isn't it?
It's
They
not.
can
No,
they couldn't decide on a Palestinian state from the river to the sea?
no. The UN doesn't have that power. That's not what the UN does. They could recognize that,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean it's true, you know.
Oh, well, there's a
Like
lot of things they recognize that aren't true, but it still has like an international impact.
it could, but it depends on what other countries do. I mean, just because the UN says something doesn't mean it's going to happen,
Well, the
you
UN
know?
is the countries. I mean, the countries would vote on it. I mean, right now, the voting blocks, I think it would not
Well, it's
end
it's
well.
the UN is the countries that vote for things. I'm sorry, a decision by the UN is based on what the countries that voted for that decision.
Right.
But but like you could have whatever, let's say it's, I don't know, 150 countries. So you could have 75 in favor, 74 no, and one abstention. So the countries are completely divided, but the resolution wins. But that doesn't mean all countries agree with what the UN says, and they're not bound by it. The
Okay.
UN resolutions are not binding
Right.
anyway.
Yeah.
So,
Ultimately, all of the recognition of the state of Palestine has been primarily performative anyway. So, I mean, that's also like sort of like a test case.
I mean, because an international, you're not a state because the UN recognizes you. You're a state if you meet the criteria of statehood.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
again, doesn't seem to matter to what 154 nations. I mean, they don't meet the criteria of statehood, but they're still recognizing them as a state. So the
Well, but the thing is, how, yeah,
new.
I think you just have to look at like some of them recognize the state and
Mhm.
engage with that state as if it's a state, but many don't. And ultimately, Israel's there. So unless, I mean, they tried to get rid of us on October 7th, but they did not succeed. So, I mean, ultimately, right? That's what it comes down to. I mean,
Yeah.
that's reality, you know.
And that leads perfectly into my final question. What does Am Yisrael Chai mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the what it means to me is Jewish people endure, you know, whatever challenges we face. Um, you know, we've gone through so many horrible catastrophes over our history, and yet we endure. And thank God now we have our country back, you
Yeah.
know, after thousands of years. You know, we now have our country back and we're now able to exercise sovereignty in our own land. You know, and that's what it means.
Yes. Thank God. And Anne, thank you. It's been wonderful
Thank
to
you.
share this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. And as they say in the old country, Am Yisrael Chai.
Thanks.